Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we are on a book club episode with Dr. Greg Lanier. His new book, Old Made New, and it's published by Crossway. So if you go to our show notes, you can find a link to Crossway and grab that book for yourself. Some information on Greg Lanier, as well as a link to find a Reformed church and confessional churches. And then there's some information on how to contact Peter about his upcoming church plant. And then there's some other information about how to connect with us through as the podcast through either email, guiltgracepod@gmail.com, Twitter, or Instagram. There's information on how to become a bridge builder. Donate some money to us, help us bridge the gap and keep growing and doing well. So we will jump into this episode and again introduce, I think for the third time, Dr. Greg Lanier.
I think it's the fourth, actually.
I think it is actually the fourth. We did. Remember we did?
Yeah,
we did like a double episode one day.
Yeah.
Your corpus and the covenant thing, and then the Septuagint episode with Ross.
That's right.
You need to have me as a third host, man.
That's right. Yeah. We'll send the contract after this episode to.
I'll bring so many sponsors. It'll be
great. Exactly. Yeah. So how's it going?
The video game, like we can have some video game sponsors,
right?
Candy Crush Saga or whatever would be awesome.
That's right. We were joking before the recording that you keep putting out all these amazing good works, and it's an occupational hazard to keep coming on our show. You're like, oh man, I got to talk to those guys again.
Yeah. If you ever put World Book through Crossway, it's an automatic entrance on our show.
Yeah. Good deal.
Fair warning for those Crossway authors, all you thousands who are listening to us. That's occupational hazard to doing it. I think it's written in our contract.
For a while, though. I have to come up with some other reason, to be honest, to be it for quite some time. So.
That's all right. Cool. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for coming on. How are things been going since we last talked?
Yeah, fine. Normal things going on. So.
Heck yeah. Well, I don't think we've actually heard kind of your background. So we introduced a question more lately that we haven't been asking previous, but just so people know who you are, because people know that you work at Reformed Seminary in Orlando, but maybe some of your background, some of your work, how you got into writing some of this stuff, and Septuagint, or the New Testament use of the Old. So just people get to know you a little bit. Quick little summary of who Greg is.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine, and our kids are in school together, and he always introduces me to people. It's like, oh, he teaches at RTS, and I was like, dude, you got to lead with something cooler than that. Like, that's an automatic conversation ender. Like, say he's awesome and good looking. I don't know. No, well, before I ended up at RTS Orlando, and actually before I even entered ministry, I was working in business for about 7 years, doing management consulting, investing, project management, that kind of thing. I actually studied computer science of all things at UNC Chapel Hill, but that was back before it was cool.
Yeah.
When I was in computer, because computer nerds run the world now, and it's like cool. But in 99 to 2003, this was the post.com bubble. Nobody respected computer nerds, and so I was there, and I had zero street cred. I was just ahead of the curve, I guess. But then I didn't do it at all. I mean, I still hack around a bit, but I don't really know how to do programming anymore these days. So yeah, then I went. It's a long story. We went into ministry after that. But yeah, I've been teaching at RTS Orlando for about 6.5 years now, and married to Kate. We've been married almost 16 years now, and we have 3 daughters. And life's good. So I'm also part-time associate pastor at a Presbyterian church up in Lake Mary, north of Orlando, and do a variety of things in that capacity. And I used to play basketball, but I can't anymore.
No.
Just because it's not worth the injuries. I do play soccer with the kids and coach them, so that's pretty fun. And I'm in the sort of kids between 6 and 12, which is a really sweet time of life, and we do all kinds of fun stuff. So I wish we could press pause on this. And
yeah, that's right, huh?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So, and I see people with like little infants in our neighborhood. I'm like, I'm good. Like, I don't miss that phase.
Yeah, Yeah, Nick's about to hit that again. He's about to have another
Oh.
infant.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so much fun when they like read and play soccer and mess around, joke with you and stuff like that. So anyway, I mean, every phase is good. So anyway, that's kind of the background.
Yeah.
Of me personally. You asked a whole bunch of other follow-ons. So which ones do you want me to answer?
Yeah. What got you into Septuagint work, kind of New Testament East to Old, all that stuff?
I don't know if I was aware of much of this prior to seminary.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard to remember back. It's hard to remember what you used to not know. But I do remember in seminary, and it wasn't a big focus. At least I went to RTS Charlotte. It wasn't a huge focus like it is now with Will Ross being there. I remember vaguely hearing about the Septuagint, and obviously when you're studying the New Testament, you can't get away from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But I didn't know a lot about it. But I kind of caught the bug then. I wrote some papers on it, and really it was in doctoral work where my whole thesis was on Luke's use of the Old Testament. And Luke, by and large, uses a Greek version of what we call the Old Testament as opposed to the Hebrew. And so I guess professionally, that's when I really started getting into it more, was in doctoral work. And it became much more of a scholarly interest of mine through that. So I kind of straddle, I'm a New Testament guy. And so if you want to play around in Old Testament as a New Testament guy, you have to do Septuagint stuff. Or use of the old and the new. So that's kind of where I dabble, and that's where Batman and our dynamic duo. He's more of a professional Septuagint guy, Will Ross.
Who's Batman and Robin though in this relationship?
Well, he's Batman, and we've decided that I'm actually Lucius Fox. I'm not Robin. I'm the kind of wizard behind the technology. So at least that's how I define it. He may call me Robin, but I refuse that.
Yeah. You guys at RTS are pumping out a lot of good works.
Yeah, you guys are. Jeez,
man. Ben Glad even. Obviously, people know about him on our show, and he wrote a nice little comment about your book as well. Yeah. And this is a really good book. Not to puff up your ego about anything, but this is an amazing book. I've read it pretty fast, and it's. I think every Christian really needs to have this. I mean,
make it happen, man. Make it happen.
Yeah.
Inflation, tuition. We got things to pay for. And my wife really appreciates it because it's hands down the prettiest cover.
It's a really nice cover. No, there's no doubt about it.
I was very pleased with that.
Yeah.
And it actually looks even better in person because the lettering is kind of glossy and stuff.
It is. Yeah, it's a really nice.
If nothing else, it's going to look good on your shelf.
That's right. If you guys don't want to read it, just frame it or something. Put it in your bookcase and just frame it. Looks good.
Yeah, it's a very good guide for you guys. Get it for your Bible study groups or whatever. It's just
not to interrupt, but on that note, I'm not sure if you saw it on the Crossbow.
The study guide, yeah.
Yeah, so at my wife's encouragement, actually, she was like, you gotta. She's told me for years, you gotta get into the Bible study game. And I was like, I'll try.
You gotta follow Nancy Guthrie. You gotta follow her.
I know Nancy Guthrie or Jen Wilkins,
right?
But I'll try. And so I channeled, and she kindly blurbed it as well. She's good friends of RTS. Nancy is. So I put on my best Nancy Guthrie impersonation. I did write a study guide, and it's available free in PDF form. There's also a spiral bound print on demand option as well. And so I do hope that could be, I just came out, it just hit like 2 weeks ago. So I don't know if anyone's used it yet, but I hope it's a helpful way to use the book in a Bible study format. It wasn't originally conceived to do that. It's not actually just like a Bible study guide. So there's a companion.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I will jump into my first question. Your book begins laying groundwork for the 3-step process of identifying the passage, double clicking on the Old Testament, and listening to the remix. So could you introduce these tools of the trade for work for the audience?
Yeah, and remix is very appropriate because we just had the Grammys, so that works.
Yeah,
yeah, the famous Grammys now.
Yeah,
right.
I kick off that way, and really the the reason why I wrote a book like this, there's obviously tons of stuff out there on the use of the old and new, including by Ben Glad and also another RTS. Now he's a colleague, Greg Beal. There's tons of it out there, and I mentioned some in the bibliography, of course. I became persuaded, and Crossway as well, that for all of the amazing stuff that's been done in this general field, and there was kind of a rebirth of it in the 60s with Dodd, 50s and 60s with Dodd, and then you have Richard Hayes, and then like 1,000 other people after that. And so it's not like a new scholarly thing, but very few, if any, of the writings and research has been done in this area. Paul's use of Isaiah or Mark's use of whatever. Very few is pitched at an audience of just regular people. Who just love the Bible and want to learn more and don't know what midrash means or how to spell it.
I don't even know what midrash means.
I mean, actually, no one knows really what we mean by midrash, so that's fine. And so I was like, someone needs to try to write a book that lay people, i.e. my mom, she gets a shout out in the book, can and would want to read. And the closest thing is Beal's handbook. And it's great. Use it all the time, assign it to students. But I was finding that even my seminary students, for all of its merits, and it's very good, even my seminary students with biblical languages struggled with the book. And it's not because the book is flawed or in any way. Again, it's a great book, but it's because the topic is so complicated, and the book sort of reflects that. And really everything else is methodologically complicated, and there's words like hermeneutics and Gezer Shoah and all these things. Like you can't get past the first page of most of the stuff without being just thoroughly overwhelmed with. It's
pitched at a high audience too.
Exactly. And so I was like, all right, maybe it's just impossible to translate it to the pew, but I'm going to at least try. And so that was where it all came from. And I did it actually. I sort of started fleshing this all out in a series of seminars in something we call Teaching Women to Teach here at RTS. I test drove it during the pandemic with like 6 people in Sunday school, unfortunately. But so the 3 steps are my attempt at saying, all right, if I'm a layperson Bible study leader, I'm busy. We got our small group tomorrow, and I'm busy at work. I don't have time, let alone even like the resources or the library, to do 9 steps that involve very close exegesis, looking at intertestamental literature, et cetera, or diagnosing 20 different options for what's happening when Hebrews uses Jeremiah 31. I've got 30 minutes. And an ESV or NIV. So I said, all right, if that's me, what are the 3 steps I just need to do to make sure I do this right? And that's where the 3-step process came from. I want it to be memorable. I want it to be something that your average, reasonably interested layperson. I hope it's useful for pastors. I hope it's useful for students as well. You can basically take these 3 steps and do them for 6 hours, or you could do it in 20 minutes. What is something, what are 3 steps that they could remember, that they could apply, they could actually do, and in fact, that you could even do in a Bible study? You're not going to be pulling out the Dead Sea Scrolls in a Bible study, unless it's maybe my Bible study of nerds. So the first Bible, and that's just an occupational hazard. The first step is actually less obvious than it sounds, and it's identify that the New Testament is actually using the Old Testament to begin with. And by the way, on that note, I don't know if we talked about this, but it's important for me to clarify, this book is not about how to read the Old Testament. And it's not about how to find Jesus in the Old Testament. There's plenty of books on that. This is about what to do when the New Testament actually uses the Old Testament in some sort of way. So just to clarify. Anyway, so the first step is knowing that that's happening. And most of the time, that's not too hard. Good study Bibles these days, or sort of modern English translations, tend to signal it through quotation marks. And sometimes the writers themselves say, as it is written in Hosea or whatever. Sometimes it's less obvious. And in the section where I develop these tools in the book, I go through one example in Luke where it's actually 2 quotations back to back, but only one is consistently flagged as such in English translations. The other is not always, and so you may miss it. course, if you're using the King James, it doesn't flag anything as quotations, doesn't use quotation marks. So you're a little bit more in the dark there. But, NASB bold stuff, most translations put in quotation marks. So the first step is knowing that you're doing that they're doing something with it. And if it's more obscure, if it's more faint, then you might have to rely on your study notes in an English Bible. Sometimes a commentary, of course, will point that kind of stuff out. So step one is identifying it. And also, and we may come back to this, part of that process is the New Testament author explicitly telling you that he's quoting something? Or is he just doing it and you may not realize it? And this is kind of the first category is more like I am doing it to bring evidence to the table, to prove something to you. Like I might cite, I don't know, some famous author to try to prove my point, as Aristotle said or whatever. Or Aquinas. I don't have a hot take for you on Aquinas, by the way.
Yeah. Be careful with the
I don't
word.
have a hot take on Reformed Thomism. You have to get someone else on the podcast for that whole.
You say Aquinas, all the evangelicals come out with hot fervor.
Or do they? Anyway, so sometimes the New Testament author, something like 240 times, they explicitly say, "As it is written." But other times they may not. And that's kind of the Pixar or DreamWorks approach, where if you pick up what they're throwing down, it's like, oh, wow, that's so cool. That's from Exodus. Even though they didn't tell me. But if you're not, if you're slower on the uptake, it still makes sense. You just may not realize that it's from the Old Testament. So step one is identify that this is taking place. Step two, and this is the step that is most easily skipped. And indeed, I did a Doctor of Ministry course on this general topic, apologies to the Old Testament, last summer, and test drove the book with that group as well. And it was interesting having conversations with that group of guys in ministry who are pursuing their DMin, because we all admit it is so easy, especially when preaching, like if Paul's quoting from something, to just acknowledge it and move on. Because it takes time. You're like, how many places do I want to flip? And I gave them as their assignments, like dense places like Romans 9, like for their practice sermons, like Romans 9, Galatians, a few other places where it's like 11 quotations in a row. And so that was pretty mean. But the point was, what are you going to do with this? Because you're not going to, unless you're like Martin Lloyd-Jones or something, you're not going to preach 40 sermons on Romans 9. And so what do you do with it? And so what I'm trying to cultivate in people and myself is, when you actually identify the New Testament is actually using something from Genesis, Deuteronomy, whatever, you need to go and look it up. That sounds super obvious. And for many people, it is obvious, but for others, it's not. It's like, oh, I've never had a pastor do that. It's like, well, or it's like, this is from the Bible. Let's move on. So I call that double clicking. You could, or pinch zooming, whatever you want to call it, where you need to go back, and if it's a quotation from Deuteronomy 30 or Exodus 20 or whatever, go and read at least the whole chapter. You don't got to study the whole book. You may not have time for that, but at least skim the chapter. Figure out what is going on in this passage. Why on earth did James use it, or whomever? What led them to it? Where are we in the history of Israel? Is this in the Pentateuch? Is this the story of the patriarchs? Or is this from the law section? Is this from the Psalms? Is this from a pre-exilic prophet announcing doom? Is this from a post-exilic prophet announcing whatever? And spend some time reading it. And the reason why that step is super important is that 99 times out of 100, in my view, and we can get into that, that's maybe more the hot take area. 99 times out of 100, if not 100% of the time, the key to understanding what Paul or Luke or Matthew or Jesus is doing with an Old Testament passage becomes clear when you study the Old Testament passage. That seems pretty obvious, but it's not in the scholarship. Most scholars would say, well, it's some sort of complicated Jewish hermeneutic that's Pesher, Midrash, and blah, blah, blah. I was like, no, actually, what if, hear me out. What if Matthew actually read Deuteronomy? What if Paul knew Isaiah really well? And what if he's just applying what he learned in studying Isaiah? Maybe that's a possibility. And so what do we need to do if that's the case? if they're actually using these Bible passages in a way that's sympathetic and informed by the context, and like, yeah, this is what Isaiah is about. It's about Israel being stupid and wandering away from God, and judgment's going to come, but then there's going to be this restoration through an anointed Messiah figure of some sort. That's Isaiah in a nutshell. Maybe Paul was familiar with that, and maybe that should inform how we understand how he's using Isaiah, as opposed to thinking that they're doing something crazy. And that's the default assumption in so much of the scholarship, even among some evangelicals, actually, is that the apostolic writers are just kind of playing fast and loose with the Bible. And therefore we shouldn't do the same, because they're just like they're just winging it. I'm like, maybe they're not winging it. Maybe the problem is us. Maybe we don't know the Old Testament very well.
Yeah.
And we're bringing our kind of broken knowledge of the Old Testament to this use of Jeremiah in some place. And we're like, oh, that's super obscure. That's not messianic. So therefore they're making it up. I'm like, well, maybe they're actually just smarter than we are. And so that's my bit of a rant. But the point of all that is the only way you sort of control for your own blind spots, the only way to get over this idea that they're all just like making stuff up from Hosea, Matthew 2 or whatever, is to go back and read the passage and see what's going on here, and how does that then shape the way I should study it. And so a key part of the step, and again, you don't have to have a PhD to do this. The Bible is there's lots of passages that are not as equally clear. Zechariah is a hard book. But in general, it's not rocket science to go back and read whatever section of Deuteronomy you're in and get a feel for what's going on. You might have some open questions. That's fine. Go ask you guys. But that's a step that so many people, I think, skip, or they give it sort of short circuit the process. And if just doing that alone is super, super important. Now, of course, it requires some level of invested interest in the whole Old Testament. And to make sense of a quotation of Habakkuk 2, which shows up a lot in Romans and Galatians, you need to know something about Habakkuk. And most folks don't know a thing about Habakkuk. And so you may need to figure out, okay, where are we? What's happening with Habakkuk? But you can spend 10 minutes and go Wikipedia that and figure it out, right? And one of the things that I've given, or not given, but one of the things I put on the Crossway product page, in addition to the study guide, is a reading plan, which I've had for a while. But basically, it cherry picks 200 passages from the Old Testament and the New Testament that follows the basic storyline from creation through exile and restoration from exile, and it matches New Testament passages with it that are relevant, so that in a reasonable amount of time, you can get the big sweep of the story. You don't have to read almost 1,200 chapters and try to like pound through that in a year. You can take your time and do that. So that's another resource people want to have to kind of up their game on understanding the Old Testament. So that's the second step. Go study the Old Testament. Third step, listen to the remix. Now, I ask you guys, what did you think of the remix metaphor? What do I mean by the remix metaphor?
I was thinking of music.
Yeah, it is a music metaphor.
Yeah, it's putting, for lack of a better word, Old Testament intention, Old Testament background, Old Testament context with the New Testament. Okay, how is this now being used? Not to change the message necessarily, but to combine it with the New Testament author for it's got a new, like this fuller meaning now that we can read, see. It's not different than the Old Testament. It's just now to its fullest extent. Right? As one of our professors, Dr. Estelle, said, there's a instant coffee in the Old Testament, and the apostles just pour in some espresso to make it a little bit stronger. They see fulfillment. So that's how I took it.
Yeah. No, I have to think about the coffee metaphor. That's an interesting one. That's the pivoting metaphors there. But yeah, that's basically right. So and I struggle with, okay, how do I get this idea across? Because when I'm trying to navigate, and this is where so many books get bogged down, is they're trying to figure out a way to navigate a sense of continuity of meaning between old and new, because one divine author, at least from a Reformed perspective, we believe in that there is an immense amount of continuity between God's purposes with ancient Israel and post the coming of Jesus. But there's also an element of discontinuity that you're trying to sort out, because when Jesus comes, that really does make a difference. That really does change everything. It's not just copying and pasting. It would make no sense for them to copy and paste from Leviticus into Matthew and assumed that nothing had changed at all. And that's the flaw of sort of, critical grammatical historical exegesis, which I never use that in the book for, intentionally, because again, I'm trying to pitch it to a particular audience.
Yep.
But it's kind of behind the scenes that for all of its benefits, the flaw with that is that you just sort of assume that the only option Paul has, if he's not going to just make stuff up, is to effectively copy and paste. Well, that makes no sense of the coming of Jesus. And so there is an element of sharp discontinuity and fullness, and history is moving somewhere with the coming of Jesus, although I argue in the book that there's elements of this even in the Old Testament itself, as they're looking back and seeing prophecies even in their own day being fulfilled.
Yep.
So the remix idea is, I'm trying to think of, okay, what's a way to help a layperson get their head around the idea that the apostles and Jesus are faithful to the original message, but that even the original message had the seeds of something that would go beyond itself when Jesus comes.
Yep.
And that's the discontinuity. So a remix, I think it's not a perfect analogy, but the idea is a New Testament author is remixing the Old Testament. What we mean by that, or what I mean by that, is a good remix makes the original obvious.
Yeah.
It's the Stones, right? Or it's Aretha Franklin or whomever. But the remix is a remix for a reason. It's not just playing the original song. It's maybe you're changing the tempo, you're adding some harmony, you're
adding some espresso,
whatever you're doing. And that's bringing out sort of new elements that may have been latent in the original, and you're drawing attention to that. So it's obvious that it's the original song in some sense. It's not a new song altogether, but it has undergone a transformation to bring out some freshness. And so that's what I argue the New Testament authors are doing. And so our job then, having studied what's going on originally in the Old Testament, is to say, all right, well, how is Paul remixing this? In what sense is he, how is his reading of Deuteronomy consistent with the original context, but how has it changed in light of the new era that we're in? That's all you're trying to do. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. I give 3 as the main options, that it's a fulfillment of a prophecy. I channeled my inner Baptist and came up with 3 P's.
You gotta have alliteration.
I don't even know. I don't have an inner Baptist, but I grew up Moravian of all things. But it's either a fulfilled prophecy, which many people stop there and think everything's just a prophecy, but that's not true. We can get into that if you want, but a fulfilled prophecy, it's a pattern that's being repeated. So a great example is Acts 7. This is when Stephen goes through all the Old Testament and says, just as your fathers did in their day, so also you are doing today. It's a repetition of a pattern, or it's a prescriptive, where God said, don't murder in the Old Testament. That's still true in the New Testament. It's actually not much of a remix here. It's like, still don't murder, and don't commit adultery or what have you. So there may be some others, but I think those 3 are at least sufficiently sort of covering the waterfront. So that's the final step. What is, John doing in remixing Ezekiel here or whatever? So that's the final step. So anyway, that's a long discussion. It's actually much shorter. Probably you can probably read the book faster than you just listened to that. But I at least gave you the color commentary.
Yeah, totally.
So that's it.
Good stuff. Yeah, good stuff. I think when I was reading it, it just helped me feel more confident, even with an apologetic flavor of knowing what and why a New Testament author is saying what they're saying and the context, and I can back it up to somebody else if I'm in a conversation of where and why did Paul say something or Jesus say something. It just helps my conversations as a believer, whether it's with another Christian or a non-believer, just proving more and more that the Bible is true. It's just amazing that, even in Isaiah 700 years before Christ is talking exactly about the suffering servant, and all these things are very clearly Christ. And Paul obviously knows the Old Testament very, very well. And to your point, these New Testament authors, all they really had was the Old Testament to go off of and write their new, to write what they're writing, and to the people around them knew the Old Testament for the most
Right.
part. So it's not like they had all the New Testament like we do in front of them, and then they're writing the New Testament. No, they just had the Old Testament. So
Right.
helpful stuff. Thank you for that. I was, you pretty much answered my next question. First time, I kind of want to help make this a little more practical for the audience. Based on what you're saying, I'm flipping to, here's a really good example of how you use the book. You have tables. You do a lot of the hard work for us. So you connect Old and New Testament scripture together for us. So we're not sitting there like, this is a really good, helpful thing you said, but how do I actually tie certain passages? You do that in this book. And so here's one. On page 90, you have the Last Supper, which is talked about in Luke 22 verse 20. And so step one, identify the passage as an allusion to from Exodus 24 and Jeremiah 31. Then you go to double click the Old Testament. You talk about both those, how they connect to Luke 22. And then you go to step three, listen to the remix. I grew up on 90s hip hop, so my mind just automatically went there. Sorry. And then
it was the best era of hip hop.
That's
right.
right.
Absolutely. And then so step three, you have three choices: prediction, pattern, prescription, and you chose prediction and pattern for these two Old Testament verses connecting to Luke 22.
Yeah,
so
pattern for Exodus 24, because Jesus is he's referring to a covenant being established in blood, which is what Moses does in Exodus 24. He throws the blood on everyone. And then it's prediction for Jeremiah 31, because he's literally predicting a new covenant to come and in the future. And Jesus says, okay, that day is today. This is the quote unquote new covenant in my blood. So it's a blend of both of those two.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. So I'll combine a couple questions with this. Because yeah, you've already kind of covered the illusion and some of the quoting, but I'll kind of combine that with the question that I have with because there's sometimes when the Old Testament's quoted explicitly, that some of the authors change some of the wordings. And so when we look back at the Old Testament, we're like, well, that's not what they said in the Old Testament. We see what Paul's doing in some portions. We're like, oh, that's a different word, or that's a different phrase than they used before. So like what in some of these more maybe nuanced, and so somebody's does have kind of backgrounds. I'm asking for, so those who may have a background are kind of wondering about some of these when the Old Testament or when the New Testament's quoting this. Generally speaking, like what are they doing when they're changing some of this stuff? Or like, are they changing scripture? Are they changing what the Old Testament authors said? Are they doing something that we shouldn't be doing with the Old Testament? How does some of that stuff work with this stuff too?
Yeah, and that's one of those like deep cans of worms that's like as soon as you start playing around in the sandbox,
yeah,
you're like, this is why it gets so complicated so fast.
Yeah,
so
this is a question I had for a long time.
Question. Because actually, I mean, in general, it's hard to quantify, but probably more often than not, you're going to notice some kind of thing like that, as opposed to just a perfect word for word.
Yeah, because a lot of them are not verbatim.
Right. And so before people hit the panic button, and I try to avoid the panic button, people hitting the panic button.
Yeah.
There's actually a handful of things you have to recognize as possible explanations before you automatically jump to the conclusion, Matt. If you pick up the reference of, anyone know the Office Space reference there, and jump to conclusion?
Yes. Yeah.
Speaking of 90s, 90s hip hop, in fact.
Yeah. A great movie.
Anyway, you don't want to automatically jump to the New Testament authors monkeyed with the wording. You don't want to automatically jump to that. Here's a few reasons why. First, for most people, we are operating in an English environment, or Spanish or French or whatever. And the New Testament is translated from what? Pop quiz. It's translated from
Greek. And
the Old Testament translated from
Hebrew with some Aramaic.
With a smidge of Aramaic. Exactly. There you go. You passed.
Yeah.
And I do this all the time with my Greek students. I've had married couples in Greek class together, and I'll point out, like, okay, look at how you translated this on this quiz, and how did your spouse translate it? Are they identical? And rarely, if ever, have they had an identical translation from Greek into English, even if they've been married for 30 years. I'm like, okay, that's because it's almost impossible to have a perfect sort of machine generated word for word translation. The fact that you have one Old Testament committee translating from the Hebrew, one committee translating from the Greek, even that alone is going to sometimes introduce differences, because Hebrew is not the same thing as Greek, and translating from both of those languages isn't perfect. It's impossible to be perfect. So that alone could account for some of it. So then you're like, all right, well, I'm a nerd and I looked at the original languages. All right, that's where we can really have the conversation. The second thing you have to realize before you automatically jump to the idea that Paul changed the text, you have to acknowledge that we don't know what text he had in front of him. That's the single biggest factor. Just like in an English church, you could have a pastor working from the NASB, you could have a pastor who's using ESV, you could have someone in the pew who's got the La Reina Valera, the Spanish translation. You don't necessarily know. The copy of the Hebrew that we use for our English Bible dates to roughly the early Middle Ages. I think there's very good reason to think it is a extraordinarily close approximation to what the early church had, but we know it's not perfect. Even the folks who copied it, the Masoretic scribes, admit that it's not perfect. And we know for a fact that there were other potential options floating around. And what we do with all that evidence is we try to work our way backwards to say, well, what was probably the original text? But every synagogue that Paul is visiting, if that's where he's going to go look up something, if he's writing a letter to Rome and he's writing in Corinth and he goes to the local synagogue because he didn't carry all that stuff with him, whatever, they're not all going to be perfectly identical. We didn't have a printing press or a computer back then. And so you can't always, in fact, rarely, if ever, can you say that you know for sure what James or Paul or Jesus had in front of them. You just can't. We don't have that evidence. We don't have the manuscript of Isaiah that Paul used. And it may be very close to what we have today, may not be. Is that a problem? No. Copies were imperfect. The original source was where we locate inspiration, but copies weren't always perfect. And so Paul is going to use whatever he has available to him. And generally speaking, it happens to be very, very close to what we have, but not always. So that's another thing, is you can't always prove it. And then the third factor is we don't know exactly in every case whether John and Paul and the others were directly looking at an actual manuscript, looking it up, or and we don't know which manuscript they would have been using. We don't know if they're citing it from memory because they learned it growing up. We don't know if they learned it from it being read in the synagogue week by week. We see that in Acts. There could be a lot of different ways that they access the Bible, just like you do as well. I mean, my heart Bible language is the NIV 84. That's what I grew up with. So I still have things memorized in that way, not ESV. And then older generations, it's they believe KJV. So same thing is true back then. Point being, there's a lot of moving parts to try to figure out what version of any given passage did John or Paul have in front of them or in their mind. And only then, if you know that, only then can you say that they quote unquote changed it. Otherwise, it could just be they're using a different version that had a slight word order change or a slightly different verb. And we don't know why, and we can have the conversation about which one is the right one. But that's just a reality. A couple other peripheral but very, very important considerations. Some of the authors in the New Testament apparently don't know Hebrew. Paul certainly did. Matthew, I think, almost certainly did as a tax collector who was Jewish. I think John tends to go back and forth, but Luke, Hebrews, maybe some others, they don't appear to have any ability to use Hebrew, or it's barely anything, if at all. And so if they can't use the Hebrew, then they're going to be defaulting to what? And you know this based on prior podcasts. What are they going to use?
The Septuagint.
The quote unquote.
Yeah, the quote unquote Septuagint.
Some Greek version that was available to them. And that version may have already introduced some sort of translational change or what have you. And so they're just going to use that.
Yeah.
And then the last factor is sometimes, and one thing we have to realize is that we have modern quotation conventions that you have to do to not get in trouble.
Yeah.
It has to be verbatim. You have to source it. You have to have a nice footnote in Turabian style. And if you change anything, you got to use brackets or ellipses or whatever. We have our modern conventions, but that is a very modern thing. That's not how it worked in the ancient world. Didn't even work that way in the Middle Ages. And so back in the old days, if you will, anybody who's quoting somebody else, there was way more flexibility in how you do it. You could change the verbs to make it work with your new context. You might change word order because you want to, or because you have some reason to. You might do a slightly different verb that's a synonym. If you look at how both Jews and Christians and pagans, if you want to call them that, how they quoted Homer, how they quoted Euripides, how they quoted Plato, they did that all the time. They're not usually actually doing it verbatim. It's considered not to be very polished to do that, to copy and paste. You're supposed to kind of make it your own. And so it's no surprise that the New Testament authors do that as well, actually to a much less degree than some of their contemporaries. They're more sensitive to the original wording than they're often given credit for. So point of all that, this is why I said it's a big can of worms. Don't freak out if your English version of Deuteronomy, whatever, in Romans doesn't match what you have in your English version of Deuteronomy. It could be a translational issue. It could be Paul using the Greek Old Testament, or he's citing it from memory, and he could be massaging the wording because that's what people did. It doesn't mean that they're changing the Bible. All that means is go back and look up the passage and sort of understand what's going on, and you'll realize, oh, he's not changing the Bible at all. He might be slightly tweaking the wording, just like I might off the cuff when I'm preaching, but I'm not doing it in a sort of nefarious way. It's just how it worked back then. And we have to kind of remember that we're talking about 2,000 years ago without Microsoft Word. And it's just a different ballgame, and not to kind of automatically assume there's some sort of conspiracy theory going on that your pastor never told you about.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good response to a critic of the Bible or an unbeliever that is trying to do a gotcha moment.
Or even like a scared Christian who's reading a quote is like, well, that's not what the Deuteronomy, like that's not what was it said in Deuteronomy. Why is he switching it? Where they're freaking out and saying, I can't do this. I don't know what to do with this stuff.
Well, one other way to think about it, if you want to talk apologetics, what if the early Christians were trying to pull a fast one on the world, and if I were trying to create a lie and a propaganda movement to take over the world, I would not allow any of that stuff to happen. Just like I wouldn't allow the sort of oddities about the resurrection appearances in the four Gospels. I wouldn't allow that stuff to stay, right? What am I going to do? I'm going to go and make sure everything is very smoothed out.
Yep.
That every quotation of Isaiah or Genesis matches across the board, because I'm going to try to shut down any possible defeaters, if you will, from every corner. That's what I would do if I'm trying to fabricate some sort of movement. And the fact that not only did the apostles not do that, but even the early scribes not do that, they resisted the temptation to smooth things out. Sometimes it did happen, but in general, it doesn't. I think that's a kind of a weird indirect argument for the authenticity of the early church, that they're not trying to fabricate the evidence. They're like, yeah, James quotes this passage and Paul quotes this passage. It's the same passage and the wording slightly different. And that's fine. I'm going to let that stand because, again, this is how we operated. That's how it was. I'm not going to try to cram everything into this like perfect, pristine world. So you can flip it around on the critic and say, well, actually, if it were some nefarious Dan Brown kind of thing going on, we would expect the evidence to be the complete opposite than what it is. The fact that it is more complicated, to me, is a great argument for its authenticity.
And if you're an eyewitness to seeing something from Isaiah fulfilled in Christ, I don't think you're initially going to be like, oh, wait, let me literally say exactly what, copy and paste. You're going to say, I saw this fulfillment. This is how I saw it. And you're going to pull either in the most vague terms allusions, but it's still going to be your eyewitness explanation to that.
And even if you did go and look it up and copy it word for word, that copy that you found in the synagogue in Jerusalem might be different than what was in Corinth.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a one word difference, it's still a difference. So
yeah. Before Nick gets to his last question, before we as we land this, but I think we kind of covered over it, but just to help people who are looking at this book and trying to figure out how to do some of this stuff. But you talked about the difference between a quote, an allusion, and then citing some of these things. So maybe quick, what are the difference, and maybe what are some of the implications of a direct quote or an allusion, or just it looks like it's close to what the Old Testament's talking about?
Yeah, and there's a whole lot of debate about the labels that we should use. I settled on those three. So a citation, as I define it, I don't really care what terminology you use, but what I mean by that is a New Testament author tells you explicitly that they are actually excerpting something. So they'll say, as it is written, or as it has been said, or as God said, or as it is found in Moses, or whatever. So they tell you, I'm using the Bible here. And then they give you some reasonably long string of text from a source passage that you could pinpoint and say, yeah, it's from this place. That's the citation, just like you might cite the IRS code or whatever. A quotation is almost the same thing. What I mean by that is you have a sentence or two or some series of words that you can actually say, yeah, that is from Daniel. They just don't tell you it is. Mm-hmm. They just do it. It's like it just rolls off their tongue, and they give you 10 words from Zechariah. They just don't tell you that they're actually doing that. And so that's a quotation, just like I might quote words of C.S. Lewis or whatever in a sermon, but not, if it's really famous, like he's not a safe lion, I don't have to say, as C.S. Lewis said in this book on this page, blah, blah, blah. I can just sort of throw it out there. And if you know the reference, you know the reference. Yeah. And then an allusion is something where it's not as easy to sort of pinpoint it's from this chapter and verse. It might be, or it's like just a general, like, oh, I'm just going to talk about Abraham here, or we're going to talk about Joshua leading us into the promised land. That's not like a specific chapter and verse. It's like a whole book or a whole character or a whole scene, the Passover. Okay, well, that's a whole thing, not just like a specific verse. So those are the three categories. And there's a lot of different reasons why you might use one versus the other. A citation is more front and center, like I'm trying to prove to you something based on the authority of God's word. So that you can't question it because you can go look it up, right? A quotation is almost more for like insiders who can pick up, like if you quote a movie, but you don't say you're quoting that movie, some of your buddies, they might get, like when I did the Office Space reference earlier. I didn't have to tell you I pulled that from Office Space, and maybe some of your listeners would have gotten the reference and laughed, even if I didn't actually tell you that, right? Yeah. And then an allusion is almost like, there's a lot of different reasons you might use an allusion. What's particularly interesting about them, though, is that often they're just trying to create a biblical world using some of the symbols and imagery of the Old Testament and say, okay, this is the kind of the world we're inhabiting. So let me talk about Abraham, the promises to Abraham. I'm not chapter and versing you, but I'm like, think about the Bible story, and this is where we are in history. Something like that. There's other ways it may play out, but they're almost, I'm trying to think of a good example. If you cite Abraham, if you allude to 7 years ago or whatever, and that's all you say, some people are like, okay, I'm thinking Civil War, I'm thinking emancipation, I'm thinking Gettysburg. Okay, now what? I'm with you. Now what are you doing with that? So it kind of plays, again, there's a lot of different ways it can play out.
Yeah,
those are the options.
I think like what you're saying too is, here's another metaphor for you. Hopefully you get it right. Allusions kind of explaining the forest, and your quotations and citing is more explaining the leaves of the tree. Okay. And something really specific.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean,
he's like, oh, I like my explanation. I forgot about that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good possibility. Again, there's a lot of flexibility. I try to tell in the book, I say, look, don't get bogged down with it. Yeah. I think too much work is spent on, is this an illusion or is this an echo? I'm like, it doesn't really matter. Just go look it up and go with it. Like, just keep moving. Yeah. One thing, as a side note, I see it's one of the questions, but maybe we're going to get to it. But one thing that we haven't really talked about, but it is a key part of the book, and it ties back into the illustrations that you mentioned, the charts and so forth, the book isn't just about those 3 steps.
Yeah.
Right.
The book is actually written, the 3 main chapters are almost equally, if not more important, where I'm also trying to help people realize why are they using the Old Testament at all? Not just sort of the mechanics of how do I do my study, but like, what's the point? And what I try to argue is that there's 3 main themes by which they bother with the Old Testament at all. Now, most Reformed nerds, we get very excited about a particular one of these, which is the Old Testament pointing to Jesus. Mm-hmm. That's a huge one. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I argue in the book is that it's not the only one. And that's sometimes surprising for folks, but I'm just quoting Jesus here. Yes, the Old Testament does point to Jesus, but it also points to the gospel, and it also points to the church.
Yep.
And so those are the 3 chapters. I go through the Old Testament and the gospel, the Old Testament and Jesus, and the Old Testament and the church. That 3rd chapter in particular, I think, is either where I'm going to people be really excited, or certain non-Reformed camps might be more annoyed. But I try to go through a lot of detail where the New Testament authors read the scriptures as a book that forms and informs the identity of who we are today, which of course is not a very dispensational idea, but I think it's there. I think it's unavoidable. So those 3 kind of categories are also just as important, because if I'm reading the Bible and Paul is quoting from something, I may have been told from the pulpit, and it may have been very exciting to be told this, because I didn't grow up knowing this, that the Old Testament points to Jesus. That's great. That happens a lot. But it's not only that. And if you think it's only ever that, then you do sometimes end up in weird places. Sometimes it's actually about justification. Sometimes it's about the, history coming to its crescendo. Sometimes it's about the mission of the church, the ecclesiological use of scripture, in other words. So I also try to prove all that out in tremendous amount of detail as well, that those 3 categories are super important as you're thinking through the use of the old and the new, that they could be doing it to show you something about personal salvation or history, something about the personal work of Jesus, or something about the church. And there's a relationship among those 3, but it's helpful to distinguish them as well. So I wanted to get that in there for folks to know that that's a key part of the book as well.
Yeah, no, that was good. That was my last question too. So thank you for asking yourself my question. No, it is.
That's why you got to hire me, man.
I know.
That's
I'm interviewing myself now.
That's right. We're writing up the contract right now as we're asking these questions.
No, it is a helpful guide, because when you're talking about something that's specific to the church, it's a guide for the church today, and something in a different category, like something about specifically Jesus, pointing to the fulfillment of Jesus today. And I mean, one last kind of sub question to get something in from on my end is before we end is, like some things aren't as obvious at first glance. And we've said on the show before, the first time the gospel is explained is Genesis 3:15. God explains the gospel, right? And then even in Genesis 4, we could connect that to maybe the church, the first time there's really a public gathering of worship. So maybe those are 2 kind of off the top of my head examples, but could you give some examples that might not be as obvious to the audience on those 3 categories you're mentioning?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. Okay, and again, I'm not looking at it from the Old Testament side, because like Genesis 3:15, with the exception of Romans 16:20, is not explicitly quoted, so that's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah.
But so I'm only looking at in the book specific places where they do engage with the text of the Old Testament, which isn't everywhere. But in terms of gospel stuff, one key point I make in the book that's enormous, and I don't have time to get into it now, is that the New Testament authors, their first place they go to figure out the gospel is a historical way of understanding it, not just a you need to believe in Jesus so you don't go to hell way of understanding it, although that's also true. They're first thinking in terms of creation, fall, redemption, and we're in the redemption part of the timeline. And over again, that's where they go to understand the Old Testament. And we're heading up. We'll have Pentecost celebrations coming up, I suppose, depending on when you post this. And that's one good example, with all of the stupid debates about tongues and baptism. Well, they're not stupid, but the debates about tongues and baptisms from Acts chapter 2. All that's fine. We can have those debates. I don't want to have those debates, but we can. More than anything, what Peter does when he quotes Joel is he's thinking about history, that we are in the last days, that something has changed in the matrix. See, there's an illusion. That's far more important than the normativity of tongues, or whether all who are far off refers to baptism, whatever. So that's a good example where he's thinking that the Bible has a timeline and a plan. In terms of Jesus, I mean, there's 1,000 we could go to for that one. So I'm going to just skip that one. In terms of the church, one of my favorite places where the New Testament develops this idea that we are eschatological Israel, which is the term I use in the book, is when Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, of all people. The Corinthians were by and large converted pagans. There were some Jews there, but I mean, they were a hot mess of a people group. And Paul in 1 Corinthians, A, he uses the Old Testament a bunch, but B, he's speaking to mostly Gentile people. And he says, Abraham, our father. And these were our fathers, which is an amazing thing he says, where he's saying, okay, you converted Corinthians are children of Abraham. That's an amazing thing he says, which I could spend a lot of time talking about, but that's kind of one of those little, like, you skip over it easily. It's like, wait a second, think about that. Think about his audience, who he's referring to there. He's not talking to Jews there. And so what does that mean for our theology or our ecclesiology? It has massive implications. So again, I get into that in more detail, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that's good. I don't know where Peter just walked off to, so I can.
Well, now we have the deer, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's good. Do you have any other things that were kind of left hanging that you really wanted to explain about this book?
No, I think we've covered enough. I get there is an appendix at the end that some people might find useful, where I do my best to catalog all of the generally agreed upon places where the New Testament is either citing, quoting, or alluding to the Old Testament. It's north of 400. Now, some folks are like, oh, it's thousands. Well, you got to limit it somewhere. And so I ended up something in the 400 range. People ask me that all the time. How many times? Well, kind of doesn't like count it, but that could be a useful resource where people could turn to.
Oh, that's helpful.
Yeah. We'll link to all these resources in the show notes, and you guys can see this on Crossway's website, but we'll link them specifically in the show notes. It's a little bit easier to get to some of this, but maybe where can people find your work and what you're doing, faculty page or Twitter or anything like that to follow what you're doing?
I mean, I maintain a personal website where I will link to stuff. I'm not super active on Twitter, and my faculty page is probably out of date, but
I looked at it. It is out of date by a couple of years.
I'll have to get them updated, but but mainly my personal website, which you can just Google Greg Lanier. It's a WordPress page, so it's not super fancy, but it has some stuff there.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on for the fourth time. We'll send you a contract for a big yearly contract. You can expect some big numbers. From us to be the third host. But yeah, thanks for coming on, talking about this book. I think it'll be an incredibly helpful guide for Christians looking to see, how do I understand how the Old Testament's using the New Testament? What's it talking about? And yeah, like you said, less for just strict categories and more. So like, I just need some help reading my Bible a little bit better and understanding the Old Testament. And we're both on this kind of warpath. We're trying to get the Old Testament better known. I'm trying to get the Old Testament better known. And it's just, I think if we understand, like you said, if we understand the Old Testament better, if we have a fuller picture of what it's doing, I think these New Testament quotations are going to make a lot more sense if we know the Old Testament a lot better.
Given that's sort of my warpath as well. It's kind of funny. I'm a New Testament professor, but most of my classes are just Old Testament classes because I can't avoid it.
Yeah.
But if we have any hope of getting new Christians interested in both testaments, and including especially the Old Testament, which is obviously the first thing that people are going to like shy away from, I think this is our best place to do it, surprisingly. Yes, I think just let's start in Genesis and read through together. That's fine. But maybe a different way is, all right, if I got to convince you to take the Old Testament seriously, but you're at least taking the New Testament seriously, well, turn with me to Matthew 1. And then let's see what he does with the Old Testament. And then that'll show people, oh, well, I'm not going to make sense in the New Testament unless I know the Old Testament as well. So that's maybe one strategy. Isn't just like hit them with the Old Testament. Another strategy is hit them with the New Testament. And when you do that, they have to read the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So it intrinsically makes it worthwhile and something that the New Testament doesn't give you the option of moving away from the Old Testament and just being a New Testament Christian. It makes no sense at all.
Because they weren't New Testament Christians; they were Old Testament Christians.
Right,
exactly. So from start Matthew 1 to Revelation 20 and 21, the whole thing is bookended with Old Testament quotations, and then it's just throughout. So.
Yeah, hopefully people use this for Bible studies, personal reading. Pastors, I would encourage you to get a whole bunch, use it in your church. Whatever we can do to get the Old Testament better known and these quotations better known. But yeah, thanks for coming on. And when you have your next thing, or we'll call you next when we want you on.
All right. It'll be a while. The next big thing I'm working on is the opposite of this book, and it's namely the use of non-Old Testament stuff.
Interesting.
In the New Testament and the influence of non-canonical things, but that'll be So I'm in the throes of that right now. So.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, we'll mark this this ambiguous date in our calendar to have you back on. But yeah, thanks for coming on, and we'll talk to you again later.
Yeah, thanks. Keep up the good work, guys.